A hungry fearing, come army steering, as the mice they were squealing in my prison cell. And the old triangle went jingle jangle all along the banks of the Royal Canal. All right, everyone, welcome here. The stanza there bought me a few seconds at least to check the tech, as always, and somehow prop up my computer, which is unsuccessful, but it should work off camera here. Anyhow, I'm John Coleman from Apocatastasis, an Institute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. This recording is a look at Cantos 23, 24, and 25 from Dante Alighieri's Purgatorio, which is the center part of his Commedia Divina. This class is a teaser for you if you are interested in studying at our college, either in person here in Connecticut or online. We offer classes in many things related to the humanities, including literature, including 3 separate college courses on Dante's Commedia. The first semester-long course for 16 weeks is the preparation, the major themes that we come across in the Commedia. We look at Dante's life, we look at his world, the medieval themes, the politics, and the worldview, the religious atmosphere, and so forth. The second course, which you're enjoying a teaser of here, is a confrontation with the poem itself, all 100 cantos. The final semester course is Dante Postmortem, although that's not the title of the course, but it is rather the Commedia and its impact in Western society after the lifetime, after the initial publication. And we look at other artists whom Dante influenced. We look at the continuation of the artistic themes in the Commedia, which we talked about last class, that Dante is himself just participating in on a certain level. We talked about the Iliad tradition going from the Odyssey all the way to much more recent publications. Dante's smack in the middle of that and is very conscious that he is carrying on that tradition of epic poetry. And then we also, in this final college course, look at, let's say, fan fiction or neighborhoods of art that Dante inspired. For instance, the Pilgrim's Progress by the great Baptist author John Bunyan, or the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, the Anglican author. So we have 3 courses. We invite you to check them out. If I may give a plug, and that is because we will be talking about the Holy Liturgy in our 3 cantos for today. Guess what? It doesn't have to be something that you read about. If you go to our website, you too have the opportunity to join in the Holy Liturgy. If you click on our drop-down tab, Liturgy, Pilgrimage, and Patrons, we have information how you can join us each and every school week online for the hours of terce, sext, and usually compline, except on bigger feasts we have vespers. And as I will explain, for the context of these 3 cantos, the Divine Office is principally the Holy Psalms, sung at various points. So we'll say God interrupts our lives, and that's what one of the purposes of the liturgy is to remind us that there are obligations and there's an order. I think that's most appropriate to where Dante's coming from today. There is an order which imposes itself on the individual. Anyway, you can find out all about that. Just click on that, and then you can find the tab, the schedule, and then some special events that we have each month. We have the Office of the Dead on the first ferial day of each month. We celebrate Little Christmas on the 25th of each month. And then for feasts such as the Golden Mass of Advent, we have liturgies in conjunction with that celebration. We have, coming up from this recording, Candlemas. We're going to have some special stuff for that as well. So check it out there. And with all of that being seen, now let us get into our walk along with old Dante. So we talked last class about the cantos where Dante is reprising his themes of art and the idea of the heroic individual, and the heroic individual who, in a sense, contains a whole people, or at least represents a whole people. We can see that with Ulysses and his families constantly in his mind. We can see that more sublimated with Virgil, because within the loins of Aeneas is the Roman people. Subsequently, we have the two famous parades in the Aeneid that will bring that to our attention. All of these heroic figures will come from you, Aeneas, if you follow what the gods are bidding you to do. Dante continues that heroic journey. Now, Dante's a little bit interesting because he's not a mighty warrior like Achilles or Hector or the other fellows just mentioned. But he's conscious that he is a soldier of Christ. And Dante, as a certain everyman, is representative of humanity and is representative of the saints striving for heaven, and can absolutely fit in the mold of the earlier heroes. So we looked at that. We looked at the fulcrum for that, which was the poet Statius, and the beautiful, delightful scene where he's talking to Virgil about how great Virgil is, but not knowing it is Virgil. And we saw Statius's reaction there. We remember, pursuant to our selection today, we remember the mention of the Holy Liturgy once again, when Statius got his ticket out of purgatory and his time was up. As it looks like my time with my camera is up, the fancy pants camera that I got. Sometimes poops out, so I will have to switch it to the not so fancy pants camera. But in any case, when Statius got his remission from purgatory, we recall that the mountain itself shook and the Gloria was sung. And so we have these little inklings of ritual within the poem. All right, and we're going to see that right off the bat with Canto 23. It's interesting, we have both the liturgical theme, and then we also have the temporal theme, and they go together. These are not mistakes. Art, if it's well done, if it is in fact art, will have nothing random in it. So we have initially this meditation on time. This meditation on time. I need to direct my eyeballs about 2 inches to the left here now that I have a new bright light to look at. Time, 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 time. One of the stanzas in Canto 23 has the word time, 5 or 6 times. And we can see where we're going with this. As we're coming to the top of Mount Purgatory, we're in the cantos of the gluttonous, or we should say the incontinent. We're moving from the those who are intemperate in food and drink, and we're moving into those who are intemperate in the ways of Venus. But in all of this, Dante reminds us that pleasure can often be a great waste of time. Now, this is not to prescribe pleasure altogether. I think Aquinas says in the Summa somewhere that, in fact, it's very healthy to take repast from time to time. But if one is incontinent, who are the souls that we're coming across, well, there's a certain abuse of time. There's not just abuse of substance or abuse of body, but there's also an abuse of time, which is outside of the individual. And so we have that, and then immediately the poet has a liturgical reference Domine labia mea aperies, eros mea monunciabit laurem tibi. These words come from, I believe, Psalm 50, 51. If I had to put money on it, in fact, I'm going to check. This psalm is said every Friday, but the verses are excised from the initial text, and they are put. Yes, it is Psalm 50 in the old Septuagint, 51 in most English translations, but they are excised from the psalm every day, and they are put at the beginning of the office of readings or matins. So they begin the liturgical day. In other words, the liturgical day time begins with this idea of praising God. Fasting is going to play a major role in these cantos. Fasting from food and drink, fasting from amorous activity as well. And amorous, let's say amorous affection, because there is affection. When we come to the circle of the lustful, they will show each other physical affection, but it will not be the bedroom fun. It will be a more chaste sort of physical embrace, which we'll get to. In any case, I'm also struck, so many themes here, so many themes. I'm also struck with the reference to the Domine labia about fasting. And this is why it's very difficult to understand, especially the Purgatorio, if you don't understand in a very deep way and in a very personal way in one's own life, the Holy Liturgy. Because a lot of these things will go over one's head. And in the divine office, which you were invited to at the beginning of this recording, in the Liturgy of the Hours, there's a bunch of titles for the same thing, the same set of rituals. At the end of the day is Compline and the Marian antiphon. Now, in religious houses, we need to understand this in the context of fasting, holy fasting, as Dante has it. In religious houses, at least, after Compline and the Marian antiphon, there is what's called the Great Silence, which is after the prayer is said, nobody in the monastery talks. The religious house, the convent, the seminary, nobody talks until the next liturgical prayer. They're going to go to sleep, and then the last thing out of their mouth at Compline was the praise of God. And now they've gone to sleep, and now it's time for matins, or in the modern rubrics, also you can do it at the beginning of lauds. Now it's time to pray again. And so in religious houses, there is a fasting from speech. So very interesting in Cantos 23 and then the subsequent, that you have this, that there's an aspect of fasting of speech. Because, in fact, the Domine Aperes breaks the vocal fast, let's say. And we're going to see that. We're going to see that. This isn't just fasting indefinitely, but rather reordering things. So, just like one fasts from the throat after Compline until the Domine labia mea aperies, right? We're going to see in Cantos 24 and 25 that there's a reformation of one's approach to food and then one's approach to physical intimacy. They're not completely excised, but they're rather reformed into something holy and something that's rightly ordered, as Dante would see it. Okay, let's go along here. Notice also that gluttony is referred to as a knot, a hard knot. And those of us, I suppose all of us, who have been given to perhaps sweets inordinately, or perhaps alcohol, or perhaps some other pleasurable substance for a long time, can appreciate the language of the knot. Remember when you were a kid and you might tie your shoelaces very, very tight, and it's so tight it's like a little pebble there. You can't undo it, or at least it seems like you can't undo it. And sometimes the habits of intemperance can seem just like that. And how do you undo a knot, especially one that's unduly tight? You undo it with patience, and that's what one needs to reorder their say bodily desires and so forth. And that's what the poet's telling us by referring to gluttony of various sorts as a knot. Then we come across our next character. Now, Virgil, of course, is still with us and will be for a couple more cantos yet. And then Statius is also with us, and you can actually see in the image portrayed above my head that you have Virgil and Dante, and then Statius is also on their heels there. Now, the fellow in the foreground is Foresi Donati. We've come across, and we'll come across, various members of the Donati family. And these were prominent figures in Florence of Dante's time. Remembering that this poem takes place on the Triduum, let's say springtime, of the year 1300, Foresi Donati, Dante's former friend and afterlife friend, had died 5 years prior. They were contemporaries, they were childhood friends, and Dante is surprised to see him. He's surprised in a good way. He's surprised to see Foresi because he thought that he was lower down the mountain of Purgatorio. He thought he had a much harder journey to take. Now, at this point, just like with Statius in his own way, in a larger way of epic poetry, now with Foresi, Dante uses the opportunity of meeting your man to wax not on epic poetry, not on poetry in the great abstract, but on the author's responsibility with his art. Now, this has come up before. What is the responsibility of the creator in terms of their audience? If the creator puts out something that is not edifying and building his audience up, and in fact contributes to their degradation, their rudeness, what is the responsibility of people? I think this is a very interesting topic for nowadays. There seems to be a belief, well, you're watching it. You don't have to watch it. Well, Dante has something else to say, that the artist, his job is to put out edifying and moral things, and that there is a responsibility. Is it a legal responsibility? Is it? No, it's not an earth. It's a much heavier responsibility. It's a moral responsibility. I'm invited to remember now the document from the Second Vatican Council, Inter Modifica, and the council, and in the years since, there's been a much gentler tone taken with all sorts of communities. But if you read Inter Modifica and you read the documents following up on the decree on social communications, you will see some of the old prickliness in the language. And the prickliness is for those who disseminate filthy things in society, whether that's of a incontinent sort or a violent sort, or just foul to look at visually. There is the old roughness with those types. And the reason is because, as I think we all can see as the years go by, the role of the media, and that media could be poetry in the 14th century, it could be the internet now, is very powerful. It's arguable, I would argue it in the positive, that probably the greatest weapon of the globalists right now is the media. And that's why one of the most curious things in the globalist adventure concerning Russia, one of the curious things they did at the beginning of the intensification of that in 2022 was to pull out all of their social media, taking away their biggest weapon against the Russian people. But anyway, the point is that media is very powerful. Dante has that consciousness. He has a consciousness of the responsibility of the creator. All right. Now, I say all of that because one of the other reasons the scholars think that Phrase is used at this point in the Commedia is because when Dante and Phrase were young, they trash talked each other a lot in their poetry. And we have examples from the Vita Nuova, which is the collection of poetry Dante did in his late 20s, and other early works. We have examples of him egging on Phrase and Phrase returning the favor in kind, talking about Phrase's wife, whom we'll get to in another context momentarily, talking about Phrase's wife being rather cold because Phrase couldn't please her, we'll say, in bed, and other things that you would expect, locker room talk and this sort of thing. So Dante now is a more mature man, and Phrase now as someone who's had some time to think about his early art career. They have a certain a certain distance from their earlier productions. Now, Dante, as I said earlier, was surprised to find Phrase in this part of Purgatorio. He thought he had a much longer time to go, and Phrase agrees with him. But he says, my wife prayed for me, and therefore I got higher up in Purgatory. And so, once again, which is really kind of the leitmotif of Dante himself in this whole journey, once again we see the communion of the saints, that the living can pray for the dead, and when we get to heaven we'll see the dead but alive in Christ. We'll see them return the favor to those on earth. It remains for the souls in hell to have suffering with no benefit at all. And on earth there can be redemptive suffering, and there can be intercession without suffering from heaven. But in Purgatory, the suffering itself is redemptive and purgatorial. That is to say, from the Latin purgare, it can be washing. Washing is scrubbing is probably a better translation of purgare. Lavare is better for washing. Like I'm going to wash my hands. Like I'm going to scrub a dish. I'm going to purgare the dish. And so the suffering in se has benefit in purgatory. In hell, it's just completely pointless, except to show God's justice. But it has no healing effect like we see in the other areas mentioned, where it can be applied to others or so forth. And just to be clear, as Dante would see it, there's no suffering in heaven, but rather the prayers of those in heaven can affect those perhaps suffering in purgatory or on earth in various ways. So anyway, all of that's the communion of the saints idea. Now, when Dante and Phrase meet, Dante begins listing famous sieges, and he makes reference, in fact, to the siege of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. There was another one about 50 years later as well, but in 70 A.D. we have, I think it's Pliny or Livy or one of them fellows, who writes about the siege, and he talks about the hunger of it, and in fact, a hunger that led to cannibalism, which is a topic we've come across at the very end of the Inferno, in the ice section, you'll recall. And Dante lists, anyhow, these famous examples of starvation. And he does so in the context of coming across to these guys on my side picture here, these fellows who are emancipated in the truest sense. They're completely eaten up with hunger. You can see all of their bones and whatnot. And the most emancipated of them is Phrase. And Dante says something very interesting, and he makes a little play on words here. It's not the end of our dalliance with physiology in the selection of cantos today, 23, 24, 25. Dante says he can read the Olmo in Phrase. So that's a little play on words, and I think a delicious way to understand how medievals saw life. There's a lot of Dante that transcends the ages, and then there's a lot that's very much medieval. And this reference of looking at Phrase and seeing the Olmo in his face is medieval. That is to say, it sees meaning in everything. Everything exists in a meta-reality. This is probably, well, outside of secularism, this understanding of an integrated worldview is probably the biggest difference of Dante's time and our time. That is to say, since the Enlightenment, we have completely set all of reality into a matrix. That is to say, we have separated it. I happen to be, as of this recording, reading quite a bit about the Enlightenment and getting into fellows like Spinoza and Descartes and Leibniz. And what was the Enlightenment errand? It was to separate what makes a pencil. If the pencil didn't have a rubber eraser, or if the rubber was hard, or if this didn't have this paper skin on it, if the pencil was made out of metal, and if the pencil had ink in it, at what point does it stop being a pencil? How do you drill down in the qualities of things? Can you strip off the qualities and still have the thing in, say, just like you can have a number in abstract, can you have a pencil, a microphone, a computer, a camera? Can you have these things in abstract if you strip away all of the qualities? That's the Enlightenment. That's not what Dante's interested in. Dante's interested in a completely integrated reality. When he looks at Pharisee, he sees homo. Now, homo is a Latin word meaning man, and it's spelled H-O-M-O, but it's pronounced homo. You don't actually say the H. So, what is the homo? Dante looks at Pharisee. He sees the homo in him. What he's referring to are the eye sockets. Remember, Pharisee is very hungry. The eye sockets are the two O's, O-M-O, and then the M is the brow ridge here, going into the nose and going across the other eyeball. So these eyeballs are the two O's that Dante reads in his face, and the M. So the point is, everything bears witness to what it is, and everything, whether it wants to be or not, is in this integrated order of God. And even by looking at Pharisee's face, Dante can see that. Now, the Canto 23 ends with a meditation on the condition of Florence, on the moral condition of Florence. He speaks about the dress of the women and the extravagance of some of the social life beyond that. And then he says, very insightfully, very prophetically, he says a moral reform will come to Florence. Now, there's no way Dante could have known about that. Just like last recording, I mentioned certain events that happened after Dante that he was able to peg correctly. And one of those was the involvement of the French in northern Italy, which wasn't actually evident there, but Dante could play out certain events, and sure enough, that's what happened. Likewise, Savonarola, oh my goodness, he hit it on the head. In the generations after Dante, 150 years later, maybe less, about that, you had Savonarola. The moral reformer of Florence, a fanatic, a type of Puritan character, a Luther before Luther, a Calvin before Calvin, a Puritan before Puritans. And he was right. Savonarola turned Florence into a Puritan dictatorship for a season there. And he was burned for it because people like to party. But nevertheless, Dante could see that luxury will eventually burn itself out. Or at least it will oscillate back and forth. I was watching something yesterday, and the person was inveighing. Well, he was imploring the universe to have us reach peak porn. When will we reach peak porn? When will when will everything just completely burn itself out? I don't know. Maybe when it happens, like it happened with the Roman Empire, you'll burn itself out, and then you'll have 1,000 years of monks, which is one way you can interpret the transition from the ancient world to the modern. Dante, in any case, sees that in Florence. He sees that they will reach peak porn at a certain point. They'll reach peak partying, they'll reach peak drinking and whatever, and it will swing back. And sure enough, I think, more importantly, that we can interpret Savonarola there. Now, I'm not intimating that's the person Dante had in mind. That guy didn't live until long after him, but very insightful reading of the tea leaves. Okay, that does it for Canto 23. Moving on to Canto 24, still with the Hungary. They're hungry now because they were gluttonous with food and with drink. And we move on and we have another reference of a tree. And we had a tree earlier, and if you can imagine a Christmas tree upside down. Christmas tree upside down, and then there was water flowing over the tree, and with any use of water, we can imagine washing and so forth. The tree is upside down because the hungry people aren't able to reach their food, right? It's like that old Greek myth where what is it? It's like the food is right outside of the guy's grasp, and then right as he's about to grasp it, it's taken out of reach farther still. I want to say it begins with a T. It's not Tarantella, but there's a Greek myth to that effect, where it's like this morsel that you want, but every time you reach for it, it withdraws. And that's what's kind of happening there. It's this penance that the gluttonous are given. Anyway, Canto 24, we have a similar tree with fruit, but now it's justice. Remember, Dante has the peas, and in the course of these cantos, another P is going to be removed. The P is for peccata, and this is the area of justice. And I find it quite interesting that we have this discussion in the context of gluttony, of food, of drink, of the bedroom. And that is interesting. Many ancient traditions had that consciousness. If you look at some of the more law-bound Abrahamic traditions, Rabbinic Judaism and Islam, of course, come to mind. Some Judaized forms of Christianity as well. You'll be familiar with the kosher rules and the halal rules. And if you do read those, it's quite interesting to see the logic. And some of the logic there is actually quite humanitarian for the animals. And I'm just kind of jagging myself, but in our time of excess and surplus, certainly, we often don't think about the moral implications. Where is that meat that we're eating coming from? Now, in the past few years, we've had occasion to ask that question with a different tone of voice. Is it being grown in a lab? Is this flour really flour? Is it little bugs? Okay, we have that discussion. But there is a moral consciousness towards factory farming. And there is something about modernity which, of course, separates us from the things that we use. It gives us more of those things to use, oddly enough, but the actual production and connection to them is very far removed. I can just get in my cars, the American podcaster Joe Rogan says, and go to a drive-through and have this perfectly made, or at least well-made hamburger or something, without any consciousness of where the lettuce came from, who made the ketchup, where did the cow come from, where did this bread come from, who baked the bread, who made the cheese, and so forth. And all of that in surplus, we can often forget about justice. If we're intoxicated, in whatever our pleasure of choice is, often we can be blind to injustices going on outside. I'm invited to remember the city of Sodom and the city of Gomorrah and some of the other ones on the plain. Part of that story is that the people of Sodom the men of Sodom, were so into their own revelry and their own gluttony of various sorts that they didn't realize the injustice. And very often, excess can lead to injustice, either because of ignorance, as I've intimated for a few minutes here, but also because of selfishness in the case of that. Right, and we can be tremendously selfish, and in that taking in of excess produce from the land, we can be unjust. We can be unjust against ourselves. Catherine of Siena says, and this happens to be in her lesson in the Office of Readings during the summertime. She has this prayer. The selection is a type of prayer to God directly, like St. Augustine was fond of using. And she says, "O God, in his ignorance, man is very unjust to himself." Right? We're not just unjust to the animals and the plants and the workers who make those in our systems, but we're also unjust to ourselves in our excess. Right? Whiskey sleep is not good sleep, as the song says. I could attest to that. Right? We're being unjust to ourselves if we hurt our health with excess. And we can be unjust to our bodies if we have undue weight. Towards the Islamic influence in the Commedia, I'm reminded of the story of Muhammad. And there was a fat fella in Mecca, and he patted his belly and said, "The fat on that would look better on somebody else. The excess food that you've been taking in that make the fat belly, that fat would be better on someone who's starving." And so Dante, in this Canto 24, brings us to the heart of justice as well, justice to ourselves and those and around us and things around us. Okay. So he has another P removed. Dante's been upgraded. And then we have, closing out this canto, examples of fasting, examples of continence, of abstinence. And we have also a look at the wedding feast of Cana, where the Virgin Mary implores Christ to turn water into wine. And Dante points out, especially in that vignette, the first of Christ's public miracles, as we all remember from Sunday school, what Dante brings to our attention is that Mary's solicitude was not for her belly, but rather for others. So she put the charity towards others ahead of her own sensual pleasure of food and drink. And then another one, as I'm wrestling with Windows 10, which is a common wrestling match that I've been known to have, is the reference to the Old Testament. And we have that of Gideon. And here we go. And the fellas who were drinking the water with comportment. I love this little picture here. So happy it came up. So we have the story from the Holy Bible. I think Gideon has like 10,000 soldiers, and God's going to show off and say, "I'm going to win the battle for you." So you can't have 10,000 soldiers, because then people say it was your soldiers that won the battle. So here's what you have to do. You have to send them down to the river. It's the desert. They're thirsty. And the ones who drink the water like dogs, take note of them. And the ones who drink the water in a civilized way with their hands, take note of them. And the only ones who had manners, it's a great little motif for children when you want to teach them manners. The only ones that had manners were 300 in number, and the other 9,300 were sent home. And only the 300 were used, and then Gideon and God and whatever won the battle, right? That's the story. So Dante uses this story of Gideon to point out, again, restraint when it comes to physical pleasure, especially drink in this case. And then finally, in this Canto 24, we have a reference to Polybius, I believe, parallel lives. And anyone who studied Roman history knows the far famed abstinence of the early Romans and their very puritanical living habits, right? And even later Romans. By the time you get to even Cato the Elder, which is still relatively early in Roman history, you have people bemoaning the good old days. Remember when Grandpa would just, sleep on the floor? He'd sleep on a board. The Roman Senate, for a very long time, didn't have cushions in it. And then Dante talks about the good old manly Romans who would look at acorns and think they had a feast. And they would look at water and they would drink water like the later luxury addicted would drink wine. Right? So the acorns and the cold water and the hard bench, these are examples of abstinence, just like Gideon and just like the Virgin Mary at Cana. So that concludes Canto 24. Now, moving on, we get to the Terrace of the Lustful in Canto 25. And again, we are reversing the order that we saw in hell. So in hell, once we crossed the river Styx, we immediately came across the lustful, then the gluttonous, and then the angry, and so forth. So there's a mirror image in purgatory. Remember our discussion of the inferno. The sins of gluttony or incontinence are more human. They are more godlike because they show an excess of love. Let us reprise that briefly here. Unlike the sins of avarice and fraud and blasphemy and the things that are deeper down in hell and towards the bottom of Mount Purgatory, these sins are the more forgivable sins. They are serious, but they are the more forgivable because they show excessive love. And in that regard, they are, in a perverted way, closer to God, who is effusive love and love in se. And that's why we find the incontinent of various sorts the closest to heaven. And so we do come across the terrace of the lustful, which will be the last cornice of people to be shrived before entering the earthly paradise, which will take up our final attention in the purgatory. And we have another very medieval aspect, and this does strike modern people as very curious indeed, and that is a discussion of human generation. In this regard, too, I think it's very, very prescient to our day in the West, and as the media of the West continues to do its work throughout the world. For the past 70 or 80 years, there has been this separation between, to use the scholastic language, the generative and the unitive aspects of the marital act. And actually, I would even say, I would also trifurcate the pleasurable aspects. And that's a mouthful. What am I saying is that in the West, since the sexual revolution, and actually well before that, the sexual act has been excised from the production of children, which I find it very interesting that we have this meditation, however biologically curious, on the generation of the fetus. We have that's out the picture. And actually, in our day, even the unitive aspect of the sexual act is largely off the picture. And what you're left with are just two people in proximity that are I don't know how to say this otherwise, they're just masturbating themselves. That is fundamentally what contraceptive sex is. You could be on top of the other person, if you forgive me, but you're just masturbating if you have contraception. At the end of the day, there's not even an aspect of bringing the other pleasure. That's what I'm saying, and the unity of the sexual act is broken there. And so becomes this hellish, isolated act, oddly enough, with another. or maybe with others these days, who knows. But the point is, Dante squarely puts the creation of life front and center in this meditation on the lustful, as he meditates biologically on blood, which is a medieval understanding of semen. That semen was a very purified type of blood. Which is interesting because I think in the Quran there's also a similar consciousness of the embryo and the egg and the sperm and all that. That the sperm is somehow blood. But anyway, that's your ancient world. That's your medieval world. What transcends his interpretation of biology is that life is there, and that's typically why religions of various sorts, not just Abrahamisms, but other sorts, too, either had sex as part of some ritual or other, or usually had some in the Abrahamic traditions as well as some others, very tight controls on sex because of that consciousness that it could create life. That you are dealing with TNT, you're dealing with the fundamentals of existence, and everything needs to take a back seat to that mystery, and so we have that brought to our attention in Canto 25. Then we also have a note in the context of this meditation on creation that God delights in his creation. So Dante is no Manichaean. Dante is no Gnostic. He is not a frowny face. Dante's God is not a frowny face God on physical matter. God delights in his creation. And so God also delights in his recreation of creation, which is what happens when this poem is taking place liturgically, and that is the Paschal mystery. All of creation is lifted up with the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And also on a liturgical note, having referenced the Triduum again, in this Terrace of the Lustful, we have the beautiful hymn Summe Clemens Deus, or Summe Deus Clementiae, which is in the breviary. Nowadays, it falls during ordinary time, or Tempus Parato, during the office of readings throughout the year. So outside of the privileged seasons of Advent, Christmas, Lent, and Easter, Summe Deus Clementiae, the highest, Summe Deus Clementiae, God of the highest clemency, of the greatest forgiveness. This graces the Holy Liturgy, and so this is what this hymn is what the souls in Canto 25 are singing. Again, why? Because the liturgy is healing. Time heals all wounds. Getting back to Canto 23, time heals all wounds. The liturgy heals the wounds. And how does it do it? Even on just a basic natural level, through constant interaction over a long time. So we have that. And those of you who have enjoyed and experienced the liturgy for months and years and decades, the Holy Mass, the Holy Office, the other ceremonies, and that whole liturgical aspect, will understand and appreciate most profoundly the truth of that, of the work of time in healing and in sanctification. And finally, in this canto, we have the consciousness of fire. And that's very obvious, the fire of passion. So the contrapasso here is that the fire will heal from passion. So very interesting altogether. So much going on here. And with that, we'll wind it down, but not before giving one final plug for ApocatastasisInstitute. I invite you to please consider enrolling in our school. We have many options for learners. We have a 3-year course of study, the Integrated Humanities, which are not available anywhere else, much like this website doesn't seem to be available. But we also have all sort and manner of standalone classes, including 3 on Dante alone, and many, many more, besides, not taught just by myself, but by our great professors, Ian Spellman and Adam Myers. Professor Rios is on sabbatical for this semester, but hopefully we'll have his talents soon praise God, the talents of many other great scholars going forward. We also have a monthly subscription option, very affordable, and that's one live class per week and then one pre-recorded class for whatever your interest in study is. And then finally, if you're really pinched for time, we have intensive courses of 4 days, very long days, but where we cover the basis of a whole semester's course. We also have The Office, and on that note, I invite you to consider that and Dante and all sorts of great things besides. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Masalama.